thank you so much for that introduction. And I love that it's running late. I think that's a sign that this is an amazing conference, because all the good conferences always run late. I just want to start by saying thank you so much for this invitation, Lewis. And I want to apologize for not having been, coming to all the sessions with the time difference. And I have had teaching responsibilities continue to this week. So, but it sounds like everything's being recorded. So I'm really excited to catch up on some of the talks. And I'm really happy and honored to be here today. So I'm going to put let me know if this works. I've been playing with different ways of doing this on Zoom. I've put a link to a Google Drive doc, and I'll also drop the document in the in the chat. And this is basically a handout that I'm going to be talking from. Is everyone seeing the Google link? Is it working? I don't think I can actually drop the file. I'll try that one more time. Feel free to copy and paste that link if people come in and don't have access to it. So this talk that I'm giving today, this is something new for me. I've been working on Hegel and Schelling, and I've been interested in thinking about their philosophy of nature for quite some time. But I'm a relative newcomer to the work of Carolina von Gunderode. And what spurred this this paper was, so I need to thank them, is Dalia Nassar. Of course, she gave a talk earlier today. And Kristen Yezdal are editing this new volume. They're editing actually two volumes. They're sort of companion volumes. One is a volume of a collection of primary texts from women philosophers of the 19th century in the German tradition. That's going to include some translations done by Anna Ezekiel of Gunderode's work. But they're also editing another volume of essays on these women thinkers that have sort of been long neglected, especially in philosophy. And so I wanted to thank them for inviting me to think about her work, and I've now gotten really excited about it. So I'm excited to discuss with you all today. Oh, Jason, you don't see the handout. Do you see it now, Jason? Yes? Okay, great. Okay, so I'll jump right in here. And a very exciting array of philosophical and historical scholarship has basically now established, I think, beyond doubt, that the concept of nature lies at the very center of German idealism and romanticism, bringing into view how all the systematic and even anti-systematic, I think, ambitions of this period all revolve around thinking about the place of humanity within a distinctly modern understanding of nature. And as Louise just mentioned, I think the interest in this conference, I think, attests to the fact, not just the interest in the topic, but how important the concept of nature is in German idealism and romanticism. In noting that this approach to thinking about nature is modern, I mean to suggest a number of interconnected features that I think define this philosophical context. So first, there is the new emerging science of biology at the turn of the 19th century, a context in which German Naturphilosophie played a central role. Of course, Zamito has done a lot of excellent work on this. Second, there is also the increasing awareness of a global and universal humanity that is continuous with nature. So what Herder called humanität, along with a creeping sense of alienation from nature that results from the disintegration of traditional forms of life. And I think we see this emphasis on alienation. It's well documented, for example, in the writings of Schiller and Hegel. Third, there is, following Andrea Wolff, the very invention of the idea of nature itself, an invention led on her account by Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt, she argues, saw the earth as one great living organism where everything was connected, changing the way that we understood our relation to nature, while at the same time inventing the very idea of nature itself. An invention that led on her account while inventing the very idea of nature as we understand it today. So against the background of these complex, but I think interconnected developments, the question of the relation between human beings and nature gradually came to be understood as a question about our relation to the earth. And I think more specifically, the human question came to be understood as part of a larger question about life on Earth, a question that I think stretches beyond biology into epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and also social and political philosophy. So that's a lot of stage setting, but I think it is within this wide-ranging context that Carolina von Gunderode's 1805 unpublished fragment, The Idea of the Earth, is noteworthy for a number of reasons. Although her contributions have long been neglected by philosophers, Anna Ezekiel's extensive research and translation work has shown that Gunderode's writings, which include philosophical fragments, dialogues, poetry, dramas, ballads, and fictional and semi-fictional fragments, were not only in dialogue with the central figures and ideas of German idealism that are very familiar to us, but moreover, she makes a distinctive philosophical contribution to the major questions of this period from a unique and underappreciated perspective. With respect to the philosophy of nature in particular, both Ezekiel and Dalia Nassar have recently argued that her position cannot and should not simply be assimilated with the views of figures such as Herder, Fichte, Schelling, or Hegel, despite engaging very seriously with the work of the first three. So building on this recent attempt to recover her distinctive philosophical contribution to this period, in what follows, I'm going to try to argue that in focusing on the earth, Gunderode's fragment and her philosophy of nature more broadly provides a different model for idealist philosophy. And what it does is that it sheds light, new light on both theoretical and practical questions. So first, on the theoretical side, I think that Gunderode's claim that the earth is a realized idea suggests an alternative approach to the very complicated concept of the idea that plays such an important role in both Schelling and Hegel's philosophies. So in Schelling and Hegel, the idea represents the foundation of their philosophies, providing an absolute criterion of truth. Although their views differ in a number of ways, the idea as an absolute criterion of truth is generally presented by both in connection with organic form, with Hegel arguing at the conclusion of the science of logic that life is the immediate manifestation of the idea. So instead, in presenting the earth as a realized idea, I suggest that Gunderode offers an alternative way of understanding both the idea as a criterion of truth and the role of earthly life as a manifestation of the idea. The idea of the earth resists both the more Platonic aspects of Schelling's approach to the idea, I think, but also the tendency in Hegel's approach, which very strongly identifies actuality with rationality. The focus on the earth as a context of truth also provides a different approach to idealism beyond the near exclusive focus on a subject-object schema. Instead, I think for her, idealism is organized around an earthly context of knowledge, one that she calls the all, or die Allheit. So that's the theoretical side. On the practical side, I think Gunderode's fragment suggests that the activities and processes of earthly life all strive towards the realization of something that she calls a collective organism, a gemeinschaftlicher Organismus. Although this idea is admittedly somewhat obscure, I'm going to suggest that the idea of a collective organism provides a different model for thinking about the ethical aims of living beings in relation to the earth, one in which virtue and justice is measured in relation to the achievement of a collective organism. Here, I'm going to focus on her suggestion that the idea of the earth is in fact something that is yet to be realized, arguing that she puts forward an ecological ethic of sustainability. In presenting her fragment as putting forward both theoretical and practical aims via the idea of the earth, I argue that Gunderode offers a viable and unified idealist philosophy, one that departs from and also corrects her contemporaries in novel ways. So, I'm going to proceed here. The paper has 3 sections. In the first section, I'm going to try to sum up what I take to be some of the most important points, the most important ways in which Kant, Schelling, and Hegel employ this notion of the idea. And in the second section, I'm going to take up the theoretical side of Gunderoda's philosophy, which is framed by her claim that the earth is a realized idea. I think this approach transforms some of the central theoretical tenets of idealism that we see in Schelling and Hegel. Third, in the final section, I'm going to discuss the practical side of her philosophy, and I'm going to frame that via her claim that the idea of the earth is something that is still in the process of being realized, talking about this notion of the collective organism. I'm going to argue that the unity of her thought can be understood via what I'm going to call in that last section a dual aspect approach, which I developed through an interpretation of her claim that the earth has a double life. So jumping in here, and the handout is going to continue in outline, but the quotes are also numbered, so hopefully that will help in following along. So the idea, going to try to quickly summarize what I take to be the most important aspects of this concept in Kant, Hegel, and Schelling. Because I think in order to understand Gunderoda's fragment in its proper philosophical context, it's important to begin with her use of the term idea, since the fragment discusses the earth as idea. Her use of this term, I think, both develops and departs from her contemporaries in an interesting way. So I'm going to just begin by charting the most prevalent ways in which I think this idea was employed in Kant, Schelling, and Hegel. So starting with Kant, so in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant introduces his discussion of the transcendental ideas by affirming the Platonic origins of his use of the term. And clearly, the use of the term idea, I think, for all of the thinkers in question, Plato is sort of in the background here. So this is Kant in the first critique. This is the first quote on the handout. Kant writes, Plato made use of the expression idea in such a way that we can readily see that he understood by it something that not only could never be borrowed from the senses, but that even goes far beyond the concepts of the understanding with which Aristotle occupied himself, since nothing encountered in experience could ever be congruent with it. Ideas for him are archetypes of things themselves. This idea of archetype is going to be very important for Schelling also, and not like the categories, merely the keys to possible experience. In his opinion, they flowed from the highest reason through which human reason partakes in them. So that's Kant talking about Plato's idea of the idea. And he's going to appropriate it in a certain way. So in affirming Plato's general approach to the idea as untouched by anything borrowed from sensation, Kant draws a distinction here between his own account of the categories, which of course, although they are a priori, are nonetheless congruent with objects of experience, whereas ideas, on the other hand, are archetypes of things themselves, and whose objects cannot be given in any experience whatsoever. As archetypes, the ideas for Kant originate from reason's activity of making syllogistic inferences, which is driven by this demand to search for the unconditioned. And we can think of the unconditioned as the totality of conditions that provides unity and a complete explanation of all of the concepts of the understanding. As is well known, although Kant in that section of the dialectic discusses 3 transcendental ideas, the soul, the idea of the world as a whole, and the idea of God. And of course, these 3 correspond to the categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive syllogisms respectively. I think ultimately there is one overarching idea of reason, and that is namely the idea of the unconditioned. In associating reason's demand for the unconditioned as a demand for something that can never be an object of cognition, the idea for Kant represents an absolute limit to reason's systematic ambitions, barring it from playing a foundational role in a system of knowledge. So clearly, Schelling and Hegel are going to affirm and reject different aspects of Kant's way of employing this term. But for both of them, I think the idea becomes central for how they approach the construction of their philosophical systems. Although they affirm Kant's association of the idea with the unconditioned, both reject the limitations that Kant places on the possibility of knowing the idea, and instead presents the idea as a foundational, absolute criterion of truth. So Ezekiel has noted that the idea of the earth resulted from Gunderoda's intensive study of Schelling's Naturphilosophie, but especially his Bruno, which was published in 1802. Written as a dialogue in which Schelling, represented by the titular Bruno, loosely referencing Giordano Bruno, Schelling presents his philosophy of absolute identity against Fichte. So the dialogue is sort of a kind of argument with Fichte, and it also shows, I think, very clear sympathies with Plato's Timaeus. But I do think that I'm going to now turn to the Bruno because I think the discussion of the idea in this text is particularly instructive for understanding Gunderoda's fragment. So I want to highlight right now 3 features of the idea from Bruno that I think are important. The first is Schelling's appropriation of the idea as the unconditioned first principle of his absolute idealism. Marking the height of his identity philosophy, Schelling's choice to associate his principle of identity with the idea is at least in part an attempt to respond to Kant's suggestion that the idea cannot be an object of cognition. In this period of Schelling's philosophical development, he is in the midst of a dispute with Fichte, in which he accuses the latter of putting forward a merely subjective philosophy of consciousness, while at work constructing a philosophy of identity that, of course, as everyone knows here, comprises both a transcendental philosophy and a philosophy of nature. The principle of identity is the absolute identity of opposites, an identity that lies at the source of all reality and knowledge. So discussing the first principle of philosophy as the idea, Bruno states the following shortly entering the dialogue. So this is quote number 2 on the handout. So Bruno's coming in here and he says, now to lay the foundation for our dialogue. We can all agree on this fundamental notion, the idea, wherein all opposites are not just united, but are simply identical, wherein all opposites are not just canceled, but are entirely undivided from one another. So I begin by praising this principle as first and as prior to all else. Identity itself, along with opposition, will form the highest pair of opposites, the identity of identity and opposition, or the identity of the self-identical and the non-identical. So as the identity of opposites, and this is what Hegel Hegel's going to call this speculative identity, both in his earlier work. So in the Differentiative, he calls this speculative identity, but that term carries forward, I think, into his mature work. So as the identity of opposites, the idea here opposes Kant's approach to dialectic, in which reason is faced with irresolvable antinomies in its search for the unconditioned. But I think it also opposes Plato's approach to the idea, despite the many Platonic resonances that are scattered throughout this dialogue. And obviously the dialogue form itself harkens back to Plato. I don't think it's an accident that Schelling wrote it as a dialogue. One of the central oppositions that is united in the idea for Schelling is that between the finite and the infinite. And throughout, Schelling also insists that the idea is eternal. Many scholars have noted that Schelling's understanding of eternity here is Spinozist. So it is disassociated with time, duration, and most importantly, transcendence, instead referring to the necessary or intrinsic connection of things. In rejecting the transcendence of the idea and appropriating the dialectic of opposites as the key to his philosophical system, Schelling's principle of identity becomes the basis for his linking his transcendental philosophy with his philosophy of nature, providing an alternative to what he thinks of as Fichte's merely subjective approach to identity and opposition. Looking ahead, Gunderoda will reinterpret the identity of opposites in terms of processes of synthesis and dissolution, with the interconnections between mortality and immortality giving shape to the earth as idea. So in addition to being the absolute principle of identity, of the identity of opposition, the idea for Schelling, as I mentioned above, is also a criterion of truth. So this is one of the recurring themes of how Schelling and Hegel use the term idea. So again, this is quote number 3 now on the handout, speaking as Bruno. He says the idea, it unites multiplicity and unity, finitude and infinity. Since we learned earlier that philosophy is solely concerned with the eternal concepts of things, we now realize philosophy has but one sole object of study, the idea of all ideas. And this one idea is exactly what we conveyed in our formulas for the supreme principle, the indivisible unity of the identical and the differentiated, the inseparability of thought and intuition. The nature of this idea's identity is that of truth itself and beauty. So one of the themes of Bruno is the relationship between beauty and truth. I'm gonna put aside the question of beauty simply for focus. So Schelling continues, for the beautiful is what absolutely identifies the universal and the particular, or unites the species and the individual, as in the ideal human forms of the gods. But the same identity is truth too, and sole truth. And since we regard the idea as the best criterion of truth available, that's the key line there, we will accept only what conforms to this idea as absolutely true, but what does not measure up to the idea's truth, we will count merely as relative and unreliable truths. So as I said, I'm going to put aside the question of beauty. So why then is the idea the best criterion of truth available? In defining the idea in terms of the unity of opposites, Schelling and Hegel too have in mind particular sets of oppositions whose unity and relation are generally taken to be a condition for truth. So in the passage we just looked at, I think thought and intuition, as well as universal and particular, are clear instances of this, but the most general unity and relationship that is at stake for all of the German idealists is the one, of course, between the subjective and the objective, with Schelling writing in the 1800 system that all knowledge is founded upon the coincidence of an objective with a subjective. For we only know what is true, but truth is generally taken to consist in the coincidence of presentations with their objects. Hegel, in the science of logic, Hegel also in the same vein, he defines the idea as the unity of concept and reality, or the unity of concept and objectivity. And he goes as far as saying that the idea is the objectively true or the true as such. If anything has truth, it has it by virtue of its idea, or something has truth only insofar as it is idea. So truth then for both Hegel and Schelling is measured in connection with the degree or extent to which the relationship expressed in the idea is realized. Although I'm going to discuss in a minute a disagreement between Schelling and Hegel and how they understand the idea, I think they do both agree that basically it supplies a criterion or a model for truth insofar as they both also define the idea in connection with the principle of identity. Schelling concludes the Bruno with this sort of nice Platonic claim. He says that to know the indifference contained in the principle of identity is to uncover the original metal of truth. That's a very nice Platonic thing to say. So third and finally, this is the last point that I want to raise with respect to how Schelling treats the idea in Bruno. Finally, Schelling, but not Hegel, understands the idea in terms of a relationship between archetypes and their visible appearances, variously described as embodiments, copies, or images of the idea. So thus, despite Schelling's anti-Platonism in rejecting the consignment of the ideas to a transcendent heaven, he nonetheless employs a Platonic model in understanding how the idea appears in the visible temporal world. In Bruno, and consistent with other writings from this period, Schelling grants pride of place to the appearing form of the organism, suggesting that it, more than other finite entities, provides an image of the archetype of the absolute idea, uniting actuality and possibility, the real and the ideal, soul and body, and also concept and reality. Although all finite things in the universe are an embodiment or image of the idea to some degree, organic nature, Schelling writes, is the, quote, most visible proof of transcendental idealism. And it offers not only an image, offering an image not only of the archetype of the idea, but it also offers us an image of consciousness. And the deduction of consciousness occupies a large part of Bruno. So the organism then provides an image or model for the organization of the universe itself, which Schelling writes is such a well-organized animal that it can never die. So in short, the appearing form of the organism is the key to Schelling's understanding of how archetypes of the idea become embodied in the visible world instead of being consigned to a transcendent beyond. So before I turn directly to Gunderode's fragment, I'm going to try to note some differences between Schelling and Hegel in their approach to the idea, ones that I think are important for situating her presentation of the earth as idea. So first, Hegel eschews Schelling's Platonic model of archetypes and images. And I think he does this largely on account of the fact that the apprehension of such archetypes is ultimately for Schelling depends upon what Hegel takes to be a very problematic theory of intellectual and aesthetic intuition. Instead, Hegel adopts an expressive or manifestation model of how the absolute appears, arguing that there is an essential relation between the inner and the outer. And this relation between inner and the outer, we'll see in a minute, is a theme also for Gunderode's understanding of the earth. This allows him to avoid a tendency in Schelling to present a reified version of the absolute in terms of a principle of identity or an eternal archetype, with Hegel focusing instead on presenting the absolute as a method that results from a developmental process rather than serving as an unconditioned first principle. In line with this shift, Hegel argues at the end of his Science of Logic that the immediate manifestation of the idea is life, where the emphasis is placed on understanding living activity as a form of knowing, rather than on grasping the archetypal form of the organism. So, of course, obviously life and organism are closely related, but I do think that Schelling is interested in thinking about an archetypal form of the organism, whereas life, at least in the end of the logic, Hegel is interested in thinking about activity. For Hegel, then, the activity of life is a realization or actualization of the idea rather than simply an image of the idea. So second, in adopting a manifestation model for understanding the appearance of the absolute, Hegel notoriously establishes a very tight connection between the actual and the rational. So here's quote number 4 from the handout. This is a passage from the Logic. He says, "We now reserve the expression idea for the objective or real concept, and we definitely reject that estimate of it according to which the idea is something with no actuality. We must not regard it as a goal, just a goal, which is to be approximated, but remains always a kind of beyond. We must rather regard everything as being actual only to the extent that it has the idea in it and expresses it." So this passage, I think, expresses Hegel's characteristic critique of merely approximating or striving for goals that are in principle unattainable or that lie in a transcendent beyond. I think in avoiding the Schellingian language of archetypes and images, Hegel focuses on presenting the idea as actuality and living activity, one that manifests in various modes and that expresses various stages of development, but always contains a kernel of reason. As the manifest reality of rationality as such, the idea is not something towards which we can directly or intentionally strive, and finite individuals are ultimately subject to the famous cunning of reason. So in the following sections, in the remainder of the paper, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to consider how Gunderode transforms the idealist context that is familiar to us in the works of Schelling and Hegel. Taking a dual aspect approach to the idea of the earth, I think her theoretical and practical contributions both correct some of the problems we find in Schelling and Hegel, while also developing and transforming idealism in the process. Okay, so the second section of the paper is called "The Earth as a Realized Idea." So Gunderode composed the idea of the earth during a period in which she was engaged in extensive study of both Fichte and Schelling, and resonances of Schelling's philosophy of nature can be heard throughout her fragment. In spite of this, Nassar has very recently argued in a paper just published that we should instead understand Gunderode's fragment as a critical engagement with Fichte's idea of human vocation, which she transforms in light of thinking about the moral goals associated with the vocation of the earth itself. Although I agree with her that this fragment can be helpfully read with the question of human vocation in view, I think Nassar's argument is premised on a division between the theoretical and practical insights of Naturphilosophie, and it's a division in which she argues one strand privileges metaphysical and epistemological questions over moral ones, and here she cites Schelling as an example. And then she says that there's another strand that privileges moral questions over theoretical questions, and she cites Novalis here as an example. Within this presupposed division, Gunderode presents a third path, arguing that human beings ought to transform themselves for the sake of the earth's vocation. However, I think that framing Gunderoda's contribution against the background of a division between the theoretical and practical misconstrues what I take to be the holistic and monistic framework of German idealism and romanticism, which, despite their differing approaches, defend the ultimate unity of theoretical and practical aims. So I'm going to, in trying to sort of set this up in terms of, right, Gunderoda's theoretical and then her practical contributions and showing how they're unified, I'm going to argue against the way that Nassar sets up this division. I'm going to argue that focusing on Gunderoda's approach to the earth as idea rather than as vocation can better account for this unity, a unity that is clearly presented in the fragment itself. So one of the most striking features of her fragment is the suggestion both that, so two claims here that I think she tries to make at the same time. So first she says that the earth is a realized idea. And then secondly, she also says that the idea of the earth is something that is in the process of being realized. So these are the two claims that I'm going to try to think about. As a realized idea, the claim appears to be that the unity and processes of the earth are a manifest reality or actuality of the idea. But as something that is in the process of being realized, the idea of the earth appears to be a projected goal whose complete realization is as yet uncertain. So Gunderoda opens her fragment with this first claim, and she writes the following. This is quote number 5 on the handout. There's a lot of quotes from Gunderoda in part because I want us to sort of hear her voice. So quote number 5, this is how she begins the fragment on the idea of the earth. She says, "The earth is a realized idea, one that is simultaneously effective, force, and affected appearance. It is thus a unity of soul and body, of which we call the pole of its activity that turns outward extension, form, and body, and the one that turns inwards intention, essence, force, soul. Now, as the whole of the earth exists only through this unification of soul and body, so too the individual and smallest things only exist through it and cannot be conceived as split in two. For an outer without an inner, or essence without form, a force without some effect is not comprehensible." So I'm going to try to unpack this a little bit. So as a realized idea, the unity that is realized in the earth is that between body and soul. But this unity has two poles of activity, she says. So there's a pole of activity that turns outward, and this appears as extension, body, and form. And then there's also a pole of activity that turns inward, manifest as essence, force, and soul. The earth exists in virtue of this unity of inner and outer, and Gunderoda claims that this unity is the condition for individual things in two senses. So first, the earth as an existing, realized unity of inner and outer sustains the existence of earthly individual things. So it's an existence point. And second, this unity between inner and outer realized in the earth is a condition for the comprehensibility of individual things. So in combining the conditions of existence and comprehensibility in this way, Gunderoda provides an alternative approach to the idealist problem of the relationship between being and thinking, or the ideal and the real, suggesting that the existence and comprehensibility of earthly things are ultimately sustained and conditioned by the earth as a realized idea. So I take it that whereas the former is non-controversial, so the idea that the claim that the existence of earthly things is sustained by and stand in a necessary relation to the earth, I think the latter is certainly novel and at least potentially controversial, namely the claim that we can only comprehend earthly individual things on the basis of a unity of inner and outer that is realized in the unity of the earth. Her presentation of the unity of the earth in terms of activity that turns outward and inward, I think also anticipates Hegel's approach to the manifestation of the absolute against Schelling. But of course, she's making this claim well before Hegel himself had settled on his own view in the 1804-1805, the Jena Logic and Metaphysics. This dialectic of inner and outer doesn't yet play the central role that it does in Hegel's later work. So I think Gunderoda here is already anticipating that response to Schelling that Hegel himself will formulate. So that the idea for Gunderoda serves as a ground for thinking about the relation between the real and the ideal is also clear from her notes on Naturphilosophie. So here, this is quote number 6. Here she discusses nature as the realized idea, and this is not taken from the fragment, but taken from her notes on Naturphilosophie. She writes, now this eternal nature is neither only real or only ideal, neither only essence nor only form, but again, an absolute unity of both, a realized idea, an essence that molds itself in forms, forms that dissolve themselves in essence, and a unity of both. So her emphasis here on the realized idea is philosophically important for a number of reasons. I'm going to try to highlight three of them. First, like Schelling and Hegel, she eschews placing the idea in a transcendent beyond, but she also directly claims that nature, and more specifically, the earth as a whole, is a realized idea. Although Schelling and Hegel do affirm that nature, of course, is a realization of the idea to an extent, both set clear limitations on nature as an idea in a way that Gunderode does not. So famously for Schelling and Hegel, nature is petrified intelligence. It is an unconscious, weak, and incomplete form of mind whose telos is the spiritual life of human beings. So whatever rationality and unity of form is present in nature, for both Schelling and Hegel, it's ultimately all about this teleological view where, right, the ultimate goal of nature is to realize itself as mind, in most paradigmatically in human beings. In arguing that the earth is a realized idea, she deliberately, I think, resists this teleological anthropocentric view, claiming instead that the unity of the earth is self-sufficient for unfolding the unity of the ideal and the real. Her understanding of the idea then, I think she not only eschews the difficult Schellingian problem of how archetypes relate to their images, but she also displaces the organism as the key to grasping the unity of the ideal and the real. Instead, she proposes what I'm going to call an earthly model of idealism, in which the unity of essence and form can take myriad shapes in connection with the earth as a whole. So secondly, the realized idea for Gunderode is not defined primarily by opposition, which is clearly the case for both Hegel and Schelling, right? This identity of opposites, the identity of identity and non-identity, these are just, they play such a central role in both of Hegel's and Schelling's systems. Instead, the earth expresses its unity through the synthesis and dissolution of different elements, with life being but one result of this process. So she writes, the most intimate mingling of different elements with the highest degree of contact and attraction we call life. These processes of synthesis and dissolution generate degrees of liveliness, harmony, death, and separation, but each individual mortal element is sustained and comprehensible only on account of participating in the unity of the earth. Although she suggests that the activity of elements on Earth must itself be understood within the context of the whole solar system, and even beyond that, the entire universe, it is the unity of the Earth that sufficiently manifests the realized idea. I think one reason for this can be found in her use of the term collective organism, which suggests that the Earth itself can be treated as an organism only insofar as it forms a unified ecosystem. In the context of what I've called her earthly model of idealism, then we can think of the indifference point, so using that Schellingian language, the indifference point or identity between the real and the ideal is realized in the unity of the earth itself, rather than simply in the unity of the organism. Instead of modeling idealism on the unity and activity of an organism standing in opposition to an inanimate and recalcitrant nature, the unity of the earth unfolds through processes of synthesis and dissolution, in which the relation between life and death is fluid and deeply interconnected. As in an ecosystem, life and death are intimately commingled, and death sustains new life. So this is how Gunderode is going to think about the sort of what I'm calling an ecosystem model of thinking about life and death. She says, quote number 7 on the handout, now when a person is dead, their mixture returns to the substance of the earth, but that within them which we called force, activity, or rather that of its materials in which the more active pole predominated, reverts to that which is related to it in the earth. These elements increase the earth's life in returning to the earth. So I'm calling this one way of thinking about, or one way of understanding, I think, what she's saying about this intermingling of life and death is through the idea of an ecosystem. So third and finally, the earth as a realized idea is also a condition for truth. Earlier, I already noted Gunderode's claim that the comprehensibility of individual earthly things depends upon grasping their unity of inner and outer, or essence and form, a unity that is realized most fully in the unity of the earth itself. Near the very end of her fragment, Gunderoda actually speaks directly to the question of truth. So she writes, this is quote number 8. She says, truth is the expression, Ausdruck, of what is always the same as itself. Justice is the striving of the all in the particular to be the same as itself. Beauty is being the same as oneself and harmonious. Love, benevolence, compassion is the longing of the particular to enjoy itself in the all, i.e. to become aware of the all in the particular and renouncing personhood, Persönlichkeit, to surrender itself to the all. This is the key here. She says, through any kind of truth, justice, beauty, and virtue, it becomes more like itself, more harmonious, and freer from the bonds of personhood. Through every act of injustice, untruth, and selfishness, the state is made more distant. So again, trying to unpack this, she says that truth is situated within a holistic but differentiated context that she refers to as the all, the Allheit, which exists in varying degrees of harmony and dissolution. It is measured in relation to the degree of harmony and reality of the all, whereas expressions of truth, beauty, justice, and virtue bring us closer to the all and also to its realization. Injustice, untruth, and selfishness create distance between us and the all and diminish its degree of reality. As the context for the possibility of truth, Gunderoda directly associates the all with the realized idea of the earth. But she argues that the immortal all is always in the midst of a process of being realized, something that can manifest different degrees of reality. One way of interpreting Gunderoda's argument that the earth is the context of truth is through the idea of environments or Umwelten, which open up a perceptual field of significance which forms the theoretical, in which forms of theoretical and practical knowledge become possibilities. So taking the earth as the interconnected system of all such environments, the increase of knowledge allows us to better bring that unity and harmony into view, whereas untruth and falsehoods diminish our capacity to see and comprehend that same unity. Moving beyond the prevalent idealist schema of thinking about knowledge and truth according to the relation between subject and object, Gunderoda's earthly model of idealism does away with the need for the very division between transcendental philosophy and a philosophy of nature, and instead conceives of truth and knowledge in connection with the unity of the earth as a whole. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the third section, which discusses the practical side of the idea of the earth, which takes up her claim that the idea of the earth is actually in the process of being realized. So although Gunderoda begins her fragment with the claim that the earth is a realized idea, as the fragment progresses, she also suggests that the idea of the earth is in the process of being realized, with this realization remaining an uncertainty. Although Gunderoda expresses uncertainty concerning whether or not the idea of the earth will be fully realized, she does discuss in detail the processes through which the idea may be realized, as well as the ultimate goal of these processes, which she calls the earth as a collective organism. Importantly, the uncertainty concerning the realization of the earth as a collective organism is not something that's barred in principle. It's not something that's condemned to an infinite striving, whose ultimate failure is assured in advance. I think nothing in Gunderoda's metaphysics suggests that the achievement of this goal is an ontological impossibility, which means that the uncertainty or then even unlikelihood of its achievement is due to the contingency of history and the contingency of individual agents acting within the limitations of their prescribed social and political contexts. So before turning directly to Gunderoda's discussion of the processes through which the idea of the earth may or may not be realized, I want to address a potential objection here, namely that she cannot both claim that the earth is a realized idea and that the earth is in the process of being realized without falling into some kind of contradiction. To answer this, I propose that she takes a dual aspect approach to the idea of the earth, one that is suggested in her claim that all things have a double being. So now I'm turning again to her notes on Naturphilosophie in order to try to get at this dual aspect view. This is quote number 9. So she says, all things are, so to speak, finite presentations of the infinite. And so to a greater or lesser extent, all things have a double being, ein doppeltes Dasein. An individual limited being, insofar as they constitute an independent entity for themselves, and a universal being, insofar as they are dependent on and connected with the universe, and therefore are at the same time participants in the infinite. This double being is the principle of all entities. Thus, all the bodies and materials of the earth are each an individual being for themselves, and also at the same time a universal being insofar as they are an element that belongs to the great whole of the earth. The earth itself has this double life. So Gunderoda goes on to discuss the double life of the earth in terms of the earth's movement around its own axis and the earth's movement around the sun. But this general philosophical distinction between the aspect of things taken as individual, independent, and limited, in contrast to the aspect of things taken as universal, connected with the universe, and participants in the infinite, can helpfully situate what I'm calling Gunderoda's dual aspect approach to the idea of the earth. My suggestion is that whereas her treatment of the earth as a realized idea considers the earth from the aspect of its universal infinite being, her treatment of the earth as something that is in the process of being realized considers it from the aspect of its individual limited being. That is, as a universal being that is connected with the broader universe, the earth is a realized idea because it participates in the universe and manifests the unity of essence and form that supports and sustains the individual elements of the earth. But the earth is an individual being that is both limited and independent. Here, the earth is continually in the process of being realized in virtue by the ongoing synthesis and dissolving of elements that can either enliven or devitalize the earth. So I now want to turn to this second perspective to consider Gunderoda's understanding of the Earth's processes, which strive to realize the Earth as a collective organism. So there are undoubtedly, I think, ethical undertones. This is why I'm calling this the practical side of her fragment. There are undoubtedly ethical undertones in her account of what is at stake in the realization of the idea of the Earth. And I want to begin by turning to the way that she describes these processes that are at work in this development. So this is quote number 10 and also 11 on the handout. She writes, each form that the elements produce is only a development of their life principle. But the earth bears the life material given back to it again in ever new appearances, until through ever new transformations, everything capable of life in it has come to life. This is when all mass would become organic. Only then would the idea of the earth be realized. And then in the second passage, 11, quote number 11, she says, thus the all comes to life through the downfall of the particular, and the particular lives on immortally in the all, whose life it developed while alive, and even after death elevates and increases, and so by living and dying helps to realize the idea of the earth. So the Earth's ongoing realization takes place by means of the combining of earthly elements into determinate forms and appearances, some combinations of which are going to constitute life, and also their dissolution back into the Earth by breaking up or dying, as the case may be. As we saw earlier within the context of the Earth as an ecosystem, life and death are intimately commingled, so much so that Gunderoda claims that the particular lives on after death in the all. Additionally, Gunderoda suggests that the realization of the earth strives towards the increase and elevation of life, with the goal of all mass becoming organic. Now, on the surface, I think the goal of all mass becoming organic seems not only impossible, but maybe somewhat absurd. Moreover, why would this be a desirable goal at all? I suggest that her further formulation of the collective organism clarifies this somewhat, as well as warns against reading the goal of all mass becoming organic too literally. Instead, I think it is more fruitful to read Gunderoda as suggesting that processes that enliven and harmonize the earth bring us closer to the goal of realizing the earth as a sustainable, well-functioning, and flourishing ecosystem, and that there are clearly processes, both human and non-human, that could undermine this goal. Of course, she doesn't emphasize this, but I would emphasize that, of course, human activity overwhelmingly undermines that goal of the earth becoming a sustainable, well-functioning, and flourishing ecosystem, and in our stage in history, to the point of catastrophe. So this is the last quote on the handout, quote number 12. She describes the idea of the collective organism and her doubts concerning its realization as follows. She says, the earth can therefore only attain its proper being when its organic and inorganic appearances dissolve in a collective organism. When both factors, being, body, and thinking spirit, penetrate each other to the point of indistinguishability, where all body would also at the same time be thought, all thinking at the same time body, and a fully transfigured body without lack or illness and immortal. I do not assert whether the earth will altogether be successful in organizing itself immortally like this. So the idea of a collective organism suggests thinking about the earth as a collective community of both living and non-living elements. The elements are mutually sustaining, and so their dissolving into a collective organism suggests that they coexist in symbiotic relations, giving shape to a living ecosystem. The immortality of the earth can be understood in terms of sustainability. Processes and relations that enable the long-term sustainability of the earth as a living ecosystem help to realize the idea of the earth, whereas processes and relations that destroy the possibility of a sustainable earth devitalize the earth and move us further away from the goal of a collective organism. To be clear, although I think Gunderoda's approach to immortality does extend beyond this thought of sustainability and it ventures into considerations of reincarnation and the afterlife, I think the emphasis in this fragment on the goal of a collective organism makes sustainability a central feature of her ethical outlook. In fact, individual acts are measured according to whether or not they bring us closer or further away from the goal of a collective organism. She writes that all single virtues and excellences are therefore mere attempts by the earth spirit to bring itself ever nearer to realizing the earth as an idea, whereas acts of injustice, untruth, and selfishness make the realization of the earth as idea more remote. Gunderoda presents a novel and clear path for her practical philosophy, which extends the context of ethical life into the context of the earth as a whole. In presenting an ecological, earthly approach to thinking about the ultimate ends of both human and non-human activity, the idea of a collective organism is a powerful alternative to the emphasis in the idealist tradition on the goal of human freedom. Without denying the absolute importance of that latter goal, human freedom itself can nonetheless only be sustained within the context of a habitable, enlivened, and sustainable earth. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly conclude here now. In this paper, I've argued that Gunderoda's fragment, the idea of the earth, represents a novel contribution to idealist philosophy that addresses both theoretical and practical concerns. Focusing on a dual aspect approach framed by her claim that the earth is a realized idea and that the idea of the earth is yet to be realized, I suggested that she presents an earthly model of idealism, arguing for the importance of the earth as a context of both truth and ethical life. In situating her work in contrast to Schelling and Hegel, I hope to have shown that Gunderoda's work is an original contribution to the philosophical period of German idealism and romanticism. And as philosophical research on her work continues to grow, our narratives of this period will no doubt change, I think, in interesting and unexpected ways. Thank you very much.